Hey y'all, and welcome to our second ever author talk. I'm so excited because this week we have the absolute honor of talking to Jamison, author of Hillbilly Queer, and I'm so excited because he's from a tiny town, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the tiny town where I'm from. So so close that I played basketball and volleyball in Cowan Gym. He's also the founder of the Facing Project, which is a national organization that creates more understanding and empathetic world through stories that inspire action. He also co-hosts the Facing Project radio show on NPR, and his work has been featured in The Guardian, Harlem World Magazine, The Huffington Post, and numerous literary journals. He lives in Muncie, Indiana.
Yes.
It feels really surreal to say that about a published author to me, with his husband Corey and their dog JJ. And to learn more about JR and his writing, you can follow him online at jrjamison.com and Twitter and Instagram at jr_Jamison. Hey, JR, and thanks so much for being here.
Yes, thank you, Shay, so much. I was thrilled when you reached out to me and said that you had read my book and you wanted to do a deep dive and have me on your show. I'm just honored too. So I'm excited to be here. So thank you for the invite.
Okay, so I guess we'll get started. First question that I have for you is, I'm curious, I obviously read your book, so I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about how your background influences who you are as a person and as an author.
Yes. And I actually took some time to think about this. So for your listeners, you did send me a couple of questions to think on in advance. This was one of them. And because I'm a writer, I decided to jot down a short poem that shows who I am and where I'm from and how that impacts me as a writer. And so I'll start off as, I'm from a place where the corn grows tall and hides folks away from the outside world. Men wear overalls and women aprons, but with the younger generation, that's all a changin'. I'm part rural Missouri and Eastern Kentucky. I'm a firstborn Hoosier, a first-gen college student and graduate. I'm a queer, I'm educated, but deeply rooted in place and family and friends. I'm a husband, I'm a writer. I'm many identities rolled into one. And whether fact or fiction, these pieces of me show up on the page for others to see, to feel, to be little pieces of thee.
Nice.
And when I write, it's important for me to help people see themselves in that story. So even when I was writing Hillbilly Queer, it's a deeply personal story with my father, and it's about identity, it's about place, it's about understanding across differences. But I was worried somebody might pick up the book and see the title and think, well, I'm not hillbilly or queer. I don't identify with that. So why would I read this? But the way that I want to tell the story is that anybody can see themselves in that story and maybe forget a little bit about my identities, even though they'll be reminded about it along the way. But they can see their own self represented in that story. And so that's important for me, that last line of, I hope you can see little pieces of thee in the writing, because that's why we all write, right? Writing's a form of reflection. We also want to help people see and understand the world through our own stories and our own eyes, but also reflected back and how that connects to their own stories and their own lived experiences. And through that, I truly believe that's how we create connections across difference. And so it's really important for me for folks to see themselves in my story, even if they don't identify like me at all.
And I think, honestly, that was one of my favorite things about the book is that, I do identify as hillbilly.
Mm-hmm.
I do not identify as queer, but I think even if I didn't identify as either one of those things, I think the story, because of how you shape the way that you're trying to build bridges with your dad. You use that kind of refrain of like connected but strangers.
Yes.
A lot. And I think that there are so many different ways that a person could identify with that in particular, that I just felt like it would be so easy for someone to connect to what you were talking about, regardless of if they were from a city, or regardless if they identified as like straight and heteronormative, or regardless if they identify, like whatever their identity was. Like I I just feel like that connected but strangers refrain speaks to so many different relationships and so many different bridges that we need to build in our lives. And so I think I think that you do the very thing that you hoped that you've done.
Oh, thank you. I mean, when I think about my different identities and my dad's different identities too, that phrase connected but strangers was so true. I mean, it was true as a first gen college student who, went to college. And, I remember my first Christmas going home and sitting there, and the conversations were starting to go toward, how's school, how are things going? But all of a sudden I was also kind of a different person to my family in some ways. And I don't think some people who are not used to rural life or used to being a first gen college student, if that's not your story, it's hard to understand that connected but strangers part that we experience. But certainly, if people can see themselves as a first of doing something, right, then they can begin to see that connected but strangers show up in their own story as well. Or if you're looking at it from the lens of identifying as queer, but my dad does not identify that way, and he's this macho man, and how are we trying to find our connectedness around that? So, my goal is through these little different intersectionalities of my own identity that people can see themselves reflected back.
And I think even like the father son aspect, like anytime you branch out and like something different than your parents, or believe something different than your parents, or experience something different than your parents, like I think the first gen college student is a really good example. Like I'm the first person to graduate from college in my dad's family, let alone the first person to have an advanced degree. And even like my mom has a nursing degree, but she was the first person to go in her family. And so my papa will tell me all the time, like, I don't understand anything about what you do, but
Yeah.
I'm very proud of you. And he'll ask questions all the time, and he always prefaces it with like, I think this is probably a stupid question, and I've likely asked it before, but can you tell me what it is that you do? And so anytime there's a divergence,
Yeah.
there is that sort of, we're still connected, but we're also strangers in this way because you don't have this perspective. And so like trying to figure out how to navigate that sometimes can be really tricky.
Yeah.
I think maybe you sort of touched a little bit on this, but I'd like to know a little bit more about it. Why do you write? And or why did you become a writer?
Yeah. Well, it actually goes way back to even before I could read. And so my mom read to me all the time. And my favorite story was Pinocchio. I loved it. I loved it so much that I memorized it line by line when I was 3 years old. And my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, lived in Springport, which I know you know where that is, but our listeners probably don't know where it is. But it's just a county south of where we're from, and in rural Henry County. And we'd go visit my big mom and my papa on their farm in Springport. And when my papa would come in from the fields, I'd always climb up into his lap and say, "Let me read to you." And he would say, "Oh, you can't read." And I couldn't, but I had memorized that entire book. And so he was always so shocked. He couldn't believe it. How do you know how to read? But the truth was that I memorized stories because I loved them. And I'd often flip through other books that I hadn't yet memorized, and I'd look at the pictures and I'd imagine the stories of what those books were based on the pictures. I was always a really imaginative kid, and loved trying to impress people by my memorization. But then I did, right, eventually learn how to read. My mom taught me how to read before I entered kindergarten. And so I just dove into books of all kinds after that, and started writing mystery when I was in suspense when I was in like second grade. I think my first story was called Mystery in the Shoebox. It's, kind of Chronicles of Narnia, where this kid finds a shoebox and a portal to another world in his mom's closet to find essentially the key that unlocks all the answers to the universe. So I always played around with writing. Growing up, was in young authors conferences,
I was
and
gonna ask.
yes,
I
I
did
won.
too.
I never won. I didn't win one dang award, but I was really involved in young authors. And then in high school, I wrote angsty poetry, and I studied creative writing in undergrad. But I wasn't sure that I could make a living off of writing. And so I gave it up for about 10 years and didn't write a thing other than memos for work or reports for work and all of that. But it was about 10 years ago that I started writing again, and I just went deep into it. And that's where I focused. And I write because writing is a deep reflection. It helps me understand my place in the world. It also helps me, like I said before, find connections to other people and their lives. And so, while writing can take the shape of a novel or the shape of a memoir or a poem, sometimes it's not any of those things, but it's just a reflection of the day and where we are. And each of those moments helps me understand who I am and keeps me grounded in the world around me.
I think writing to process is sort of an understudied art, is an underutilized tool for our lives and for reflecting on exactly what you said, who we are in the world, how we've learned to be in the world, who we're becoming.
I think so too. It makes me so sad when I see colleges and universities moving away from the liberal arts because writing and reflection is an essential tool that everyone needs to have. Now, not everybody wants to grow up to be a novelist, right? And that's totally fine, but we do need to provide those spaces in the classroom for students to reflect about themselves because that's critical thinking. Right. And I mean, what every employer wants a critical thinker. Every profession wants a critical thinker. And so, the goal isn't always to create a novelist in every child, but the goal is to create those critical thinkers who grow up and become critical thinking adults who navigate throughout the world. And unfortunately, we continue to move more and more away from that. And it's frightening.
I know. Well, and like the more and I feel like you demonstrate this in the memoir as well, like the more you write to process and the more you are able to take a critical look at yourself, the more like awareness of your own biases you are able to cultivate. And then based on that, then you're able to have some of the difficult conversations that you have with your dad in a compassionate and humane way,
Yeah.
instead of just, hollering and, screaming at the top of your lungs because you vehemently disagree with things. And I think that that's really important. Like, because I'm fully on board. Like I've never understood the unfriending, unfollowing, I'm cutting you out of my life because I don't agree with you. And I think maybe I've never understood that because I can't do that because it's my mama. It's my daddy. It is, my mama and papa. Like these are my family and they have loved me my entire life. And even though we disagree, like I can't just cut them out. And I don't think that does anybody any good. And so I said in my reaction video that I'll drop tomorrow, that's one of the things that I loved the most about your book is that you encourage people to take the hard road and to have those really difficult conversations. And I think that in writing to process who we are as people, we can better understand how our biases impact the way that we see the world and how the way that we see the world then impacts the way that we communicate with one another. And then because there are some just like beautiful moments in your book where you are compassionate toward your dad, and he is compassionate toward you, in moments where you don't agree with one another and you don't really understand each other because you have different perspectives on the world. And I think that is I think that's what the world needs. I think that that's what we need is people who are willing to build bridges rather than burn them. And so, yeah, I just really love that about your book. And I think that writing to process who we are is like deeply connected to being able to do those things.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is hard, before I started writing Hillbilly Queer, and even before I took the trip with my dad back to his hometown, I started seeing on Facebook, on social media, people announcing, oh, I've, unfriended or defriended so and so because of X, Y, and Z, and I'm not going to have people like that in my life. I'm an adult. I don't have to deal with that. But that just creates more silos. And we don't often want to believe that the silo we're in is the wrong silo, right? Because we want to believe that we're right. We're always right. But the problem with that is we're just in this echo chamber, the silo, and we're not seeing or hearing or understanding why people who are completely different from us, who have different values, why they do what they do, what are the motivating factors. And at the same time, now fast forward right to where we are in 2021, we have things like QAnon showing up.
Mhm.
And that's, more proof that people say, look, this is why. But the thing is you have to know how to navigate that and determine like what is actually QAnon and what's not. So for instance, somebody like my dad, he's completely not a QAnon supporter. Now, could he get pulled in by some of, these not fact check stories that are out there? Absolutely he can, but that's all the reason why I need to keep my dad in my life so that we can have these open conversations and he's not being recruited or pulled away into this mindset or group of people who are ready and willing to recruit someone like my father. And same for me, right? I consider myself to be fairly liberal, but I also think that my dad keeps me a little more grounded toward the middle. And I say that often the toughest work is done in the middle. It's not done on the left, it's not done on the far right.
Mhm.
The hardest work is done in the middle. And people may disagree with me on that, but I hold steady on believing that that is absolutely true.
And I think for folks who have experienced that for a majority of their lives, they probably feel that way too. But for folks who that may be a new thing, or they may not have ever had to do it because all of their family members are on the same page as them, but when you, when you go home, when you walk in and you see a signed picture of Donald Trump next to your 10-year 4-H plaque in your family's curio cabinet, like, it's like, oh, it is hard work. It's hard knowing which battles to pick and which to leave alone.
Yeah.
How far to stick in one battle, like how long do you keep hashing it out, I mean, there are so many unknowns, and I don't know that really anybody ever gets it right. I don't know that exists, but I think that the right is in the discourse.
Yes.
So I really appreciated that about your book. Because I sometimes feel guilty. Like, am I supposed to be doing this? Am I, do I need to unfriend Uncle so-and-so and Aunt so-and-so because of what they post on Facebook? And it's funny. I think it was this last election cycle. One of my liberal friends posted something that made some assumptions about folks on the right. And I responded and I was like, well, this is, I saw this like on my family's feed or whatever. And she's like, yeah, I don't see anything like that on my feed. And I'm like, that's because you've curated life in a way that you don't see those things. Facebook's algorithm has curated your online social media experience in a way that you don't see those things. But because my family is on sort of the opposite side of the spectrum as me, and I refuse to unfriend them, even though I don't agree with everything that they think and believe, I see reasoning from them that you don't, because you don't have that experience.
Yeah.
So I just think that that's interesting. And for anybody who's never been in a silo, I don't think that I think that metaphor is lost on a lot of people because they've never been in one or they've never been near one and they don't know what it's like, but it is an echo chamber for sure.
Oh yes, yeah, it is. And also, I mean, playing on that metaphor, if it's full
Yeah.
and you go in from the top, what's going to happen? You're going to sink and you're not going to get out.
You're gonna suffocate
It's
and
going to,
whatever's in there.
yeah, it's going to kill you.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good. I had never thought about that before, but you're right. Like that's a really good extension of that metaphor, like thinking about how suffocating
Yeah.
in terms of like thought,
Yeah.
being in an echo chamber is, being in a silo is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love my liberal friends. Like I said, I'm very liberal, but
Come
sometimes
on.
I'll see some of their posts on social media and I just have to shake my head at times.
Yeah.
And I wish that they had somebody like my dad in their life. And those are hard conversations to navigate with friends. As I mentioned in the book, I was really worried about being labeled a Trump
Yeah.
sympathizer because I'm not.
No.
I was not a fan of the Trump presidency, and I'm not a fan of the idea that he may be running again. That terrifies me. But I love my family. I love my dad. And so that man wasn't enough to separate my father and me. It was up to us to figure out how to navigate our lives together. It wasn't up to anybody in Congress. It
Mhm.
wasn't up to anybody on the far left or the far right of our echo chambers telling us what was right or wrong. It was the two of us who had to sit down and navigate our own lived experiences, our past, our present, and what our future was going to be. And nobody else could do that but us. And in this part of the country, as you know, family is really important and it's hard to leave. It's really hard to leave your family. And that's something that when I talk to my friends on the coast, they just don't totally get. Like, why would you stay in Indiana? You could live anywhere doing what you do, but this is home. And I think it's hard for people to understand rural life and rural communities and how important place and family is to our experiences.
Yeah. And just how like reliant you are. I mean, it's such a clannish system still,
Yeah.
like my Uncle Frankie fell off his combine, so my papa helped him pull in his crops, like it's just you family is it, you
Yeah.
do for family. That was always our motto, you do for family. And so when I was leaving to come to Texas for school, um my partner didn't understand why my mom cried like every time she saw me, like why everybody was so sad, and why, like he just never understood like why she wanted to keep us all so close. And I'm like, well, because you didn't grow up in this environment, you didn't grow up in this system, you don't
Yeah.
understand the way that family has always functioned and how it's helped us keep each other safe, and it's helped us take care of our kids in a safe way, and it's helped, like there are
Yeah.
so many things that families do to support one another, and had to
Yeah.
in order to survive. And so
Yeah.
that lingers.
And two, I mean, before, internet became, I mean, even still, the internet in some rural communities is really hard to get,
Oh, man.
especially, there's still like satellite internet in some places. And it's just,
My students still had dial-up.
wow. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's still true in some places around here. I know some of my friends who live out in the county have like satellite internet, and if the wind's blowing the wrong
Use
way
that.
or whatever, like they just don't have access to it. And
Yep.
that's another thing I don't think people understand. But even before access to internet, or technology, I don't think other people understand that closeness too was also about we really didn't have connections to the outside world.
Mhm.
We were what we had, and like we had TV, of course, and that was like our connection to the outside world. But the way we're connected now across the world is totally different than when we were growing up and what that was like. And so leaving too also means, are you going to come back a different person?
Mhm.
And that's really hard, I think, for rural families to accept when their kids go off to college or move away for a little while and maybe we'll move back home into their community. How might we be different? And I think, you know, most families embrace difference or growth in their kids. And I'm not saying that rural families don't, I think they do. But there is that that difference. It's like when I came home, like I mentioned earlier in this interview, when I came home for Christmas the first time, my freshman year of college, and just feeling like I was an outsider all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I wasn't happy either place. Like I wasn't happy at school because I didn't know how to I didn't know how to exist in a place that housed 40,000 students. I didn't know how to live in a dorm that held like the same number of people in my town.
Yeah.
I just didn't like
I remember walking into my first class freshman year of college. It was Theater 100, and it was in a lecture hall. It held 200 people. And I was like, this is the class. I mean, my entire school was 300 people, right? I had 41 in my graduating class. And so a class of 200, just a class period of 200 people, I just couldn't believe it. I mean, thought it just seemed like a whole different world.
So I wasn't happy there. I wanted to come home all the time, but when I was at home, like home didn't feel like home anymore either.
Yeah.
And so it's like you exist as an out-migrant in this like interstitial space where it's like you're just constantly trying to figure out like who you are in relation to the space that you're in at all times.
Yeah.
How do I interact with people in this space? You know, I'm in the city. I don't know. Like,
Yeah. I mean, it's total code switching.
Yeah.
You know, I think about that all the time. Like I've had to code switch in two different ways. Like one is the rural urban divide and being in higher education, you know, like you are. I worked in higher ed for almost 20 years. And that imposter syndrome is real, and code switching. And why I love what you're doing. So, you know, following your Twitter feed and talking about, you know, the day where we can write academic articles in our normal language that we grew up speaking and learning. What might that look like? I love that conversation. I think that's so beautiful because it's true. We're forced to code switch, and one slip up, and then there's a worry about like, oh gosh, I just said ain't, or, you know, said y'all or something like that. How are my colleagues going to react to me? And, you know, usually people laugh and they see you as like, oh, you're so folksy. I heard that
Country bumpkin.
Yeah, you're so folksy. But it's true in the gay world too. You know, LGBTQ folks, we have our own code language that we use. Some people may not know that. I've taught a lot of my straight friends that language just because it's fun and they love it. But you know, code switching in both of those ways between the straight and queer world and also the rural and the urban and educated world. We spend our whole lives code switching, and it's rough. You never know when you can be your true authentic self. And after time, you start to question, who is my true authentic self, right? Who am I still that person I was years ago? And the truth is we are, right? We're pieces of all these different things that have made us who we are today. But it is hard, that code switching. And I'm sure that same thing is true for first-gen students who grew up in an urban environment as well, right? Or grew up in the city. Coming to higher education, that code switching is probably really challenging as well.
And it's my hope that translanguaging like becomes like I mean, I think we're on the upswing of like making it more acceptable, but there are still certain varieties of English that are more acceptable than others. Like I just feel like the kind of English that I grew up speaking is still just considered wrong.
Yeah.
It's not considered a variety, it's just considered wrong. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'm trying to make it acceptable because it's exhausting to try to police my language while also communicating what I actually mean to folks. One of the things that really caught me off guard, because I learned in school, right? The first interaction I had around the fact that I was wrong and that like my family members were dumb was around ain't. And I used ain't in like my honors English class. And my teacher very publicly let me know that we don't use ain't and it's not a word and whatever. And I looked it up in the dictionary and it was in there, and I was like, well, it's in the dictionary, it's a word, right? It would be totally acceptable to use. But I learned that like I needed to be able to speak and write the way that they wanted me to speak and write in order to be successful in the way that I wanted to be. And so I feel like there's a lot of loss there I can remember the way that my grandparents would say things and still say things that I feel like I should be able to produce naturally, but still come with some, like, I have to think about it first. But the one that really caught me off guard is, I don't know if this is part of y'all's like language practice, but I'm a cooperative overlapper, which often makes Zoom really hard. So to build conversation with someone, we anticipate what their words are going to be next to show how closely we're listening to somebody. My mama will actually move her mouth while you're talking to
Oh,
show
wow.
that she's like forming the words that you're forming, so that she's like, really, I'm really paying attention to you. I know what you're saying. And then we'll like finish each other's thoughts based on what we think is going to come next. And it's not considered rude. It's not considered an interruption. It's considered a sign of respect that you are listening so closely to somebody that you can anticipate what their next thought is going to be. And if you get it wrong, then there's a conversation built around why you weren't on the same page, and then you continue on with your conversation, right?
Yeah.
That's not acceptable in graduate school. I learned very quickly.
Yeah.
It's rude. It's seen as rude, and I didn't realize that. And so then I just felt like a total hillbilly in the derogatory way, and not the way that we've reclaimed that word. And so I think that thinking about how language works, and this is part of your book that I really appreciated too, is like you figuring out, like, is hillbilly an identity that I can reclaim? Is it still part of who I am? Is that something that I feel comfortable, identifying as like mine, as claiming as mine? And I think that language practice has a lot to do with that, and that is hugely connected to place and where we are at any given time. And so that's like part of my mission. Like, let's let people use double negatives in writing.
Yeah, I love it. Keep pushing for it.
One day we'll get there, I hope. One day. Okay, so I feel like we've gone on kind of like a tangent rabbit hole, but that's totally fine because I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, but I know that time is precious. And so just for English teachers who might want to watch this with their students, I'm curious about what your writing life is like.
Well, I'm a plotter and not a pantser. So I don't know if you're familiar with those terms, but plotter is somebody who outlines everything, and a pantser is somebody who just sits down, you write from the seat of your pants, right? I'm more of a plotter. I could be a pantser at times, but if I'm writing an actual full-length, like my memoir, or right now I'm working on my next book, and I outline that whole thing. Now it may change some as I'm writing, because the writing process, I'm actually a pantser. So I've outlined it, but then I get in the document, I'm a pantser, right? I'm just going with what's coming to me at that time. But I carry a moleskin with me all the time. I get inspiration when I see certain things out in public that I'll jot down. If I don't have my moleskin, I have my phone and I jot down in the notes. Right, different things that I see that might give me inspiration. That could be a conversation that I overhear in the grocery aisle between two people, and I'm like, ooh, this is interesting. And they probably think I'm just texting, but I'm actually, right, looking at them as characters and typing down, what they look like and their actions and all that. When I'm actually writing, so the process of writing Hillbilly Queer, there were two parts of the writing. One was I had to essay most of the flashback scenes. And so I laid out, because I'm a plotter, essentially how the book was going to flow. I knew that I needed to make connections between my life and my dad's life, with him growing up in his hometown of Steelville, but also me growing up in Callan. And so looking at those connections, I wrote about 10 or 12 different essays. And then I set those aside and I wrote just the going abouts of the book. So, the travel, all of that. And then I whiteboard. I'm a huge fan of whiteboarding. And so I started to write out the different chapters and what the themes were of those chapters. And then where did those essays begin to fit in as flashback scenes? And so then I fractured the essays and put them throughout the book. And so that's my process on writing a full-length book. But if I'm just going to write a short story or some flash fiction or a poem, I just, I'll see different inspiration and that I'll jot down in my phone or in my Moleskine, and then I'll come back later to my laptop and start to think about what that means and what that is and writing that out. But definitely for a full-length book, I have to plot it. I have to plot it out, even though I may veer off course in places, and that's okay. But for me, I find plotting to be the best way to complete the project. And then finding the space to write is really important too. So many people would say to me, like, how did you write a book? I wish I could, but I just don't have the time to do that. I'm like, I didn't have the time either, but you have to make the time. And so I did every Saturday mornings, and my husband works in healthcare and he works nights. So he sleeps in. And, he doesn't get up until the afternoon because he has a flipped schedule. And so on Saturday mornings, that was my time where I was alone, he was in bed, and I would get up and I'd write. And some Saturday mornings I'd get up and I just didn't feel like writing. Sometimes you just don't feel like writing, it's just not coming to you. So I would make sure on those days, that's when I would do research. And I would clean up my notes too. And that was a bit of how my process worked to keep me on track to make sure that I actually finished the book.
And so then I assume in your notebook, then your entries look different. Like it's not always the same thing. Like maybe it's like a quote here and there or a list, or do you doodle? Like, do you draw as part of your process, or are you just more of a straight print kind of person?
I'm more of a straight print kind of person, but it's all over the place. So, I'll have a thought after I've already written several thoughts that connects to a thought at the top. So I'll circle it and draw an arrow up to the top pointing, so that later when I look at that page, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I remember. Like these two things are connected. So I do a lot of that on the written page before I sit down at my laptop. I'm not much of a drawer. I wish I was an artist, but as some people in my family would say, God doesn't give with both hands. So my talent was writing and not drawing. So, but I will like scribble. I'll make little scribble marks or whatever, or I'll, fill in like one little line on the page in really dark black, right? But mostly it's just straight up notes.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think writer's processes really fascinate me because everybody is so different. I mean, obviously sometimes there are some overlap and similarities, but like everybody has their own process. And I think that's really important for young writers to see that, like,
yeah,
the 5-paragraph essay isn't how everybody writes. Outlining isn't how everybody writes, and you can write in ways that work for you. And like, that is the point, right? That is the point.
Yeah, I mean, I have writer friends who don't do any kind of outlining. They sit down and whatever comes to them is what they start writing. And that works for some people, and that's okay. Nobody should be pigeonholed into one process. We all have our own process. Sometimes it takes time to learn what your process is because and there's a place for that, right? But educators will sometimes put us into the certain box that they need us to do in order to write an essay or to write a paper. And then when you get out of school, you start to think that's the only way. So, and sometimes it is for people. That is their way. But you do have to sometimes figure out what works for you, and there is no wrong answer as long as you get to your end goal of what you want to accomplish.
I have 2 more questions. Is that okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So one is, you mentioned that you're writing another book. Yes. And so I thought we could talk about recent and future projects. I mean, obviously we've been talking about Hillbilly Queer, but I know that you do a lot of other stuff with the Facing Project and stuff. So, what are you most proud of? Like, what do you have in the works? Like, give us all of the details.
Yeah. Well, I am really proud that I did finish the book and that it's out in the world for people to read and consume and react to and all of that. I really am proud of that because I didn't know if I knew I wanted to finish it, but life gets in the way sometimes. Even though I would put Saturday mornings down that I would work on the book, there were sometimes weeks in between moments when I would sit back down to write just because I would have a project at work that would come up that I need to focus on. So I'm really proud that I finished it and I was able to get an agent. I spent an entire year pitching literary agents And it only takes one yes. I almost gave up. I really did, because it's a process that's very disheartening. You pitch an agent and sometimes you don't hear back, or you'll hear, this was okay, but it's not right for my list. I actually had one agent told me to stick to doing just the pacing project and not try to focus on writing. Yeah, I mean, they can sometimes be very mean, and it was a demoralizing process. And so when I finally did get a literary agent after a year and pitching 83 agents, I was just so happy. But then, she had changes she wanted made to the book. So then it was going back into that. And so it just felt like something like that wasn't ever going to happen. I just felt like, is this ever going to happen? And so I'm most proud that it's out in the world. I am working on another book right now, and it is YA. So the funny thing is I never thought that I would write a memoir. So even though my work at Facing Project is all about narrative nonfiction and helping people tell those stories, I studied creative writing in undergrad, and my focus was young adult literature. And that's what I read. That's what I love. I mean, I do read nonfiction and I read memoir, but I love YA. And that's why I'm glad I'm connecting with you, and maybe that's why you liked Hillbilly Queer, because I think I kind of wrote it too in a way like a YA novel is written. So I'm working on a book right now that I can't tell you a ton about because it's still in the early stages, but I'll just say that it's Stand By Me in the movie meets John Green's Paper Towns meets The People We Keep.
Okay.
And it's very rural, it's very queer, it's very YA, and I'm super excited to finish it. And hopefully it makes its way out into the world.
Well, I know someone who would be thrilled to read it, especially if you had advanced reader copies to give out.
Oh, yeah, totally. Once they're done, I'll send you one.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I would be so excited. I'm so excited to read it. And I like one of my caveats when I was like, because I post to a lot of groups, on Facebook, as one does. And I'm a member of a lot of YA groups. And I was like, this isn't technically YA, but like, I don't know. And like this show is like reading rural y'all, like it's supposed to be all about YA literature. And I think I said in my first in the summary video for the book, like this is a book that kids should read, and there's a lot of memories from like your time in high school, and like I don't know, like even though it's not technically YA because your perspective is as an adult, like I do really feel like there are a lot of connections to like not only the style of YA, but like sort of the not the mission, but I guess kind of the mission of YA, which is to be somewhat pedagogical in a way that like helps kids figure out like who they are, who they want to be, how to be in the world, how they want to be in the world, that they can be who they are in the world, I really got that vibe from it. And I think that's what YA is all about. And so I'm hyped. And then you're writing a YA book. That's so exciting.
Yeah, I love it. I was working on it this morning, so it's still early on. I mean, I came up with the idea for this book probably about 6 months ago, and I started plotting it out. And part of my plotting is creating character descriptions for every character, even secondary characters. I need to know where they're from, what motivates them, all of these things, their favorite t-shirt, what music they listen to, if they were on screen and they were an actor who would be playing them. I even have those kind of notes. So, it took several months to just get all of that plotted out and outlined. And I started writing a couple of months ago. I'm only a few chapters in, but I'm hoping, if my literary agent likes it and we start working on it once it's finished and she pitches it and it gets a publisher, it's probably going to be a couple of years down the road before it's out. Publishing is so slow.
Yeah.
I mean, by the time a publisher is like, yes, let's make this book a reality, it's typically about a year and a half before the book actually comes out. So because I'm still writing this, it could be 2 or 3 years down the road, but just stick with me. And if it does come out, I will send you an arc.
I'm here for it. I will wait. So you were talking about like the demoralizing process of pitching ideas. So my last question is, what advice do you have for young people and or teachers who want to pursue writing as a career?
Just don't give up. You know, I gave up writing for 10 years because people, when I was an undergrad, people in my family, professionals, advisors who I believed in, told me that there was no future in being a writer, that I would make no money, and that I would need to find a different career, and writing would have to be a hobby. And that can be true. It is hard to make money in the writing world. You have to be creative and mix it up. So I tell people all the time, it's a bit of writing, it's a bit of storytelling through speaking, and it's a bit of being creative in other ways and connecting with other creatives to collaborate and work together. And if you want a life where you are kind of hobbling together these different things, right, to make a living, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I spent 10 years giving up writing because I just thought that there was no way. There was no way to make money. That if you became a big time writer, that was a needle in the haystack and it wouldn't happen to everyone. And so rather than pursuing that, I gave that up and I did a totally different career path, which I'm thankful for. I love all the colleagues I met on that career path. It taught me a lot. But finally getting back to writing is where I felt like for once, like this is who I am and this is who I was meant to be. And if you just believe in yourself, you'll find others who believe in you and your work. You just have to find those people. And it can take time. And just don't give up. And you know, as far as the literary agent world goes, you'll hear it just takes one yes. And that is so true. I waited so long doing the pitching and I almost gave up again. But I finally got my one yes. And that's all you need is the one yes from somebody who believes in you. And you'll find your people, you'll find your readers and those who believe in your work. And so don't give up, I guess is what I would say. It's easy to give up because it is hard. It is competitive. People often say like, oh, writers aren't competitive against each other, and that's actually just not true. Like it is to a sense, like we do support each other's work, but there are only so many slots in traditional publishing and spaces, and oftentimes queer people, people of color, rural people, we're pushed out of those spaces, and we're finding our ways into those spaces now, and especially YA. You know, like you said, there's a lot to be done to grow YA in the rural side, but YA has done a ton in the last few years to bring diverse voices to life by diverse authors. And I'm thrilled by that. And there are more slots opening up in that arena. And so I would just say to writers or even educators who want to pursue that route, just don't give up. It just takes one yes. You'll find your people, you'll find your readers, you'll find your supporters. And then after that, the rest is limitless.
Well, that was my last question. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. Never in my life did I think that I would be able to have conversations with published authors. Um, and so this is like, I don't know, it's kind of surreal for me, but it's also really fun. And I just really appreciate all that you're doing with the Facing Project and with your writing. And I'm just really grateful that you were with us today. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It was an honor to be on your show.